little bit about the laws in Rhode Island that exist?
Yes. I discovered partway through, probably after when the director of the Department of Health was doing all that she could to stand in the way of proper treatment for Lyme patients in Rhode Island. It was at a conference, now that I recall, in Massachusetts, that all the, what I call bigwigs, were there presenting. And it was at the end of that conference that they all were on stage to sort of close up, and they were soliciting questions from the attendees. And I stood up and said, what can you suggest that can be done in Rhode Island to provide better care? And one of the what I call experts stood up and said, in Rhode Island, you have laws that will solve your problems. So the next thing I did was run downtown to the law library and got copies of the laws on Lyme. And very interestingly, they were developed in 2002. In April, all of the experts, and still are, they're all still not necessarily seeing patients, unfortunately, but they came from all over, the Northeast primarily, on 2 nights in April 2002 to speak at the Crown Plaza in Warwick. The first Wednesday they presented their information and documentation and knowledge of how to treat Lyme. The first person that I had ever heard of, as far as the first doctor's name I had heard of was Boroscano, because oddly enough, I had a friend growing up here in Rhode Island who'd married a man in Colorado, and she, I heard later, had been coming to New York from Colorado to see him, and she at the time was in a wheelchair, and she got out of the wheelchair after seeing Boroscano. So the first night of this conference, or whatever, was very successful and invigorating. And the second night, there were 250 patients signed up to give testimony. And they went until 12:30 in the morning because this was so pertinent and so important. And that's when the laws were, and actually it was precipitated by a lawyer whose sister was very debilitated and very ill with these infections. And that was April, and the laws were signed in July by then Governor Almond. And from all I have learned is that they never were instituted at all. They went into the archives, which is where I found them. And so then I started that campaign very ferociously.
I'm going to back up for a minute and just ask you about the laws. There are laws protecting the patients and the doctors as well?
Yes. And I believe that I put that on one of my billboards, but that protect you and, yes, the
right, you had a
doctor, I
billboard.
did.
You had a billboard.
I had a few billboards.
Are they still up?
Yeah, no, they're not, no. Actually, the advertising woman called me Sunday and asked if I was ready to do anything else, and I said, no, not right now. I'm focusing elsewhere. And so, all right.
One of your undertakings, one of your big undertakings, was to let patients know that these laws exist so that they can be treated.
What did you ask me before?
I was just asking you about the laws and if you, what else basically was going on with them. Just a clarification.
Oh,
of
what
the
they
laws were
covered.
about.
Yes, what they covered. There are 6 parts of the laws. The first 5 were signed in 2002. The 6th one was signed in 2014 at the urgency of a woman whose son was very, very ill here in Rhode Island. And she had hooked up with a Lyme group in another state. And they were involved in drafting the laws. And so that coverage was for insurance. And to this day, that still is not in effect. And it's very clear, the laws, I did some legal work in my career, and the laws were perfect. There was no need to add anything or edit anything. And people would say to me when I would talk to politicians, for instance, about putting these into effect, they would say, well, that'd take time, you got to bring it before this committee and blah, blah, blah. I said, no, the laws are perfect the way they're written, in my opinion. And the coverage was for the doctors to be able to treat according to their and the patient's desire and wisdom. And then the patients, when their blood was being sent out for testing, and this, I believe, is in other states, but I don't know if it's ever been utilized, the patients were to sign a disclosure saying that the blood work would not be used as a diagnosis. And one of the problems right now is the doctors are still saying your test was negative, you don't have Lyme. And that is prohibited by this law, and I believe there's a federal law on that.
Was Rhode Island the first one? Because
Rhode Island was the first state to develop this, and then other states wanted to come on board. Massachusetts started some work, New York did, New Jersey did, Pennsylvania did, and Virginia. Those are the ones I'm aware of, that they hopped right on it and started to try and get the same
and a lot of
requirements.
them did. And a lot of them did.
And a lot of
It still exists today.
Yeah. But in Rhode Island, they're back in the archives. I got a standing ovation at a conference in Maine when I announced it was the night before the conference when the movers and shakers get together, and I announced that I had finally gotten the Rhode Island Department of Health to post the laws on their website, and also to post that there was an alternative protocol, treatment guidelines, other than the CDC. And and so I got a standing ovation for that, because those in attendance realized exactly what a struggle that was, having been involved from the very beginning in the development of those laws. And
How did you do it?
How what?
How did you do it? How did you get it done?
Oh. People ask me that often about a lot of things. It's just who I am. I have always been a mover and shaker, and I have always taken on causes. My institution does not accept things that are not right and should be addressed. And so this was just, when I found out about the laws, it was, I have to do something about this, and I still have to do something about it. I'm preparing another shove to the current governor and the current director of the Department of Health, who I also worked with. She was the head of the infectious disease department when I was working with the head of the department. And Teresa Paiva-Weed, who was the Senate president at that time, she took an interest in my campaign, and she was the representative from Newport. She came to one of my support group meetings to learn, and she brought 3 people from her office, and they wrote copious notes during the meeting. Teresa asked a wealth of questions. She was just aghast at what the situation was treating Lyme patients in Rhode Island at that time. And so she hooked me up with this other doctor at the Department of Health, who is now the current director. And I had 4 meetings in person with her. Mary went with me. And that was just fruitless. The last meeting we had, the National Guidelines Clearinghouse had put out the edict that the Infectious Disease Society guidelines were not to be followed, and that the NELAD's guidelines were the only protocol to be used in treating Lyme patients. So I questioned her. I said, how can you reconcile that you're still using the infectious disease protocol when the National Guidelines Clearinghouse has put out that NELAD's is the guidelines? And she said, who's that? I said, the National Guidelines Clearinghouse. She said, I have no idea who they are. They can't be important. I said, they are the national, as in Washington, D.C., guidelines that supervise medical protocols and and practice, and they have spoken out on how Lyme should be treated. She said, well, I've never heard of them, and so they can't be important. And so I turned to Mary and another member of my group who was with us, and I said, okay, we're out of here. So that was my last meeting with her. Now, I have contacted her in the last year because she now is the director. The previous director resigned, I think, rather quickly. And so right away I got in touch with the governor to find out how they were going to replace her. And they had formed a search committee to do that. And so I put together a petition to the search committee, and to ask to have someone who was Lyme literate as the leader of Lyme, or someone who at least, they didn't have to be able to treat patients, but they needed to accept the fact that treatment was in serious shape and critical. And so when they picked the current director, who I had been working with in the department, I thought, well, that's okay, because at least she knows. She can't say she doesn't know about the issue because I spent quite a bit of time informing her and I submitted what I called my scrapbooks to the previous director, 9 of them. And things that were coming to me from all the resources, Johns Hopkins, Cornell, Columbia, and from the practitioners, the doctors, I put together scientific data and things I was learning and articles and papers that the Lyme literate doctors were putting out, and I submitted them all. And I also gave the department copies of Under Our Skin and Emergence. And I was doing a presentation sometime after that, and I couldn't find my copy of Emergence. So I went to the Department of Health to ask to have it back, to borrow it for the time being till I could to do a presentation. And they didn't have it. Subsequently, I found out that someone in the office of Department of Health had taken them home. And I would bet you, I will maybe challenge the governor right now to go to the Department of Health and find out where all those scrapbooks and all that information is, because I doubt that it's anywhere.
So where they stand right now is where they stood.
Exactly.